Imagine being dressed in layers of fabric so heavy that every step feels like dragging a curtain behind you. Now imagine needing to relieve yourself in public, surrounded by others, with no private bathrooms in sight. This was the daily reality for countless Victorian women. Beneath the elegance and glamour of the 1800s, their lives were chained by rules of etiquette, fashion, and shame. While men could slip into an alley or use a public urinal, women faced a far more humiliating struggle. Victorian society prized female modesty above almost everything else. Women were expected to appear graceful, pure, and composed at all times. Even mentioning bodily functions was considered vulgar. Yet behind the polite smiles and flowing gowns, women still had bodies that needed relief. The problem was that society refused to admit this truth. So, they had to invent bizarre, secret, and often disgusting methods of dealing with something as simple as going to the bathroom. Their dresses were part of the problem. By the mid-19th century, crinolines, those wide, cage-like skirts supported by steel hoops, had become a fashion craze. These skirts could stretch several feet in diameter, swallowing up entire chairs and making it nearly impossible to sit comfortably, let alone slip into a bathroom stall. The corsets women wore squeezed their bodies so tightly that many fainted just from the pressure. And beneath it all, stockings, petticoats, and drawers added even more layers to fight through. In short, the clothes were a prison. Yet Victorian women were expected to maintain perfect composure. No matter the urgency, no matter the discomfort, they had to act as though everything was fine. Their solution? A secret world of chamber pots, portable devices, and dangerous habits. These methods were not only degrading, but sometimes unhygienic and downright disgusting. It's hard for us today to imagine how humiliating this must have been. But for women in the 1800s, this was just daily life, a hidden battle fought in silence, under lace and silk. The elegant image of Victorian femininity hid a reality that was anything but elegant. And soon you'll see the truth. How women used bizarre contraptions, how carriages doubled as bathrooms, and how the fashion of the time forced them into choices we would find shocking today. Because beneath the surface of Victorian grace, there was always a silent question. How did they do it? The Victorian woman was a prisoner of her own fashion. Beneath the silks, lace, and tightly cinched corsets lay a simple truth. The body did not care about elegance. Hunger still gnawed, thirst still demanded attention, and most inconvenient of all, nature still called. But how does one relieve themselves when buried beneath 20 pounds of fabric, steel hoops, and layers of petticoats? This was the daily problem every lady faced. Simple trip to the privy was no small affair. To undress would take half an hour and possibly the help of a maid. In public, it was nearly impossible. Unlike men who could make do with hidden corners, women were trapped by their own clothing. The result? Strange inventions, shocking habits, and unhygienic compromises that would make modern readers shudder. The dresses themselves were a nightmare. A crinoline, a dome-shaped cage of steel hoops worn under the skirt, became wildly popular in the mid-19th century. It made women look angelic and grand, as if they floated through the streets. But when the time came to squat or sit, the cage was unforgiving. Spread wide, knocked over furniture, and trapped women in doorways. Imagine trying to use a chamber pot while wearing a bird cage strapped around your waist. The very thought is almost absurd. To make matters worse, restrooms, as we know them today, did not exist in most public spaces. Indoor plumbing was rare outside wealthy homes, and public toilets for women were almost non-existent. Men could find a urinal in the city, but women were often forced to hold it in for hours, waiting until they returned home. Doctors of the era even noted the health consequences: urinary tract infections, bladder issues, and fainting spells from retention of water. But society didn't care. Modesty mattered more than comfort. And so women were forced to adapt. Some carried portable chamber pots disguised as fashionable accessories. Others relied on servants to manage the awkward task of lifting skirts in private corners. The wealthy had entire retiring rooms in theaters or hotels where they could be assisted in private. But for the average woman in the street, there was no escape from the discomfort. This silent struggle created a hidden world of secret devices and whispered advice passed between women. Manuals of etiquette carefully avoided the subject, pretending it did not exist. But diaries and letters revealed the truth. Even the most glamorous lady lived with constant anxiety. Over when and where she could relieve herself was a problem no amount of lace or powder could hide. And it led to the invention of some of the strangest, most undignified contraptions of the Victorian age. For Victorian women, the most common solution was deceptively simple: the chamber pot. Nearly every household, from the grandest manor to the humblest cottage, kept one tucked discreetly beneath the bed or hidden behind a screen. But while men could relieve themselves in privy outhouses or public urinals, women were trapped by layers of fabric and the constant pressure to remain modest. Chamber pots, therefore, became an uncomfortable necessity. A chamber pot was essentially a ceramic or metal bowl that could be used in the privacy of a bedroom. But for women, especially those in bulky crinolines, accessing it was no small feat. They had to carefully lift their skirts, maneuver over the vessel, and somehow maintain their balance without spilling. Worse still, chamber pots often had no lid. Their contents lingered in the room, filling the air with a sour stench until servants emptied them, sometimes not until morning. For the wealthy, there was another invention: the necessary chair. These looked like ordinary wooden chairs, but had a hole in the seat and a pot fitted beneath. They were upholstered and decorated, designed to disguise their purpose. On the surface, they blended seamlessly into the furniture of a parlor or bedchamber. But when needed, a woman could quietly sit, her skirts concealing the act, while her maid discreetly attended to the cleanup. It was refinement built on hidden humiliation. Even so, these methods brought complications. In houses without proper drainage, servants often dumped waste directly into gutters or cesspools, creating foul-smelling hazards in the streets. Disease thrived in these conditions. Typhoid and cholera spread rapidly in urban centers, fueled in part by the very waste disposal methods that chamber pots encouraged. Ironically, while Victorian society obsessed over appearances and propriety, its hidden hygiene practices contributed to some of the deadliest outbreaks of the era. And yet, chamber pots and necessary chairs were only part of the story. Women could rely on them in the safety of their homes, but outside. At theaters, social gatherings, or long carriage rides, the situation became far more desperate. How did they manage when no chamber pot was nearby, and no private space could be found? The answer reveals one of the strangest and most secretive accessories of Victorian fashion. Inside Victorian homes, the reality of women relieving themselves was far less glamorous than the novels and portraits of the era suggested. Without indoor plumbing in most houses, the chamber pot was the most common solution. These were small bowls, or buckets kept discreetly in bedrooms, often hidden beneath a bed or inside a cabinet. Women in their huge dresses would quietly excuse themselves, lift layers of fabric, and squat over the pot. It was undignified, but it was practical. Servants would later empty the contents, often into cesspits, rivers, or even the street. The smell of unwashed pots was part of everyday life, lingering behind the lace curtains of Victorian homes. For wealthier households, a more elaborate option existed: the necessary chair. These chairs looked elegant from the outside, designed with polished wood and cushions, but inside, they hid a chamber pot. A lady could sit as though resting while privately relieving herself. This was considered more respectable than squatting over a simple pot. However, even these chairs offered no real sanitation. They simply disguised the act, creating the illusion of refinement while the reality remained the same. The etiquette around chamber pots was strict. Women were expected to pretend that bodily functions did not exist. Discussing such matters openly was considered scandalous, especially for members of the upper classes. Privacy was valued, but in many homes, true privacy was impossible. Servants often shared rooms with their employers, and the sound of chamber pots being used at night was a common background noise. It was an open secret that everyone relieved themselves, but society insisted on maintaining the illusion of delicate purity. Public settings added another layer of challenge. If a woman was attending a social event in a grand ballroom, she might have to sneak away to a retiring room where chamber pots or makeshift facilities were kept. These spaces were rarely comfortable, and the act of using them while dressed in a corset and multiple layers of skirts was awkward and time-consuming. Some women even carried small bottles or traveling pots hidden in their handbags when going on long carriage rides, because stopping at a private restroom was nearly impossible. But while chamber pots and necessary chairs were the standard, they were also symbols of inequality. Servants were responsible for cleaning them, a job both humiliating and dangerous, as exposure to waste spread disease. For wealthy women, this hidden labor allowed them to maintain an image of grace, while poorer women had no such luxury. Still, the chamber pot represented more than just practicality, was a silent reminder of how Victorian society tried to mask natural human needs under layers of silk, lace, and denial. Yet this was only part of the story. As cities grew and technology advanced, new inventions began changing how women managed these struggles, revealing another chapter of hidden Victorian hygiene. The Victorian dress was more than just fabric. It was a prison of cloth, wires, and social expectations. Beneath the polished surface of silk and satin hid a reality most people today would find shocking. Every pleat, every bow, every stiff hoop of the crinoline concealed not only the woman's body, but also the crude system she relied on to relieve herself. The chamber pot became a secret companion. Women carried them discreetly in bedrooms, boudoirs, and even under carriages. The upper classes, who prided themselves on refinement, still crouched over ceramic bowls, just like the poor. Servants were expected to carry these pots away, often splashing and leaking. A humiliating reminder that even queens and duchesses had the same bodily needs as common maids. But what about public spaces? This is where ingenuity turned into desperation. Some women lifted their skirts and used dark corners or gardens, hiding behind friends or large parasols. The crinoline, so wide it could span 4 feet across, was both a curse and a shield. It blocked movement but could also hide the act itself if one was quick enough. Then came the urination devices. Advertised in hushed tones in ladies' catalogs, these contraptions promised privacy and grace. They were shaped like funnels and allowed women to relieve themselves while standing. Some were made of pewter or porcelain. Others were stitched into undergarments. They were sold under delicate names like portable conveniences or ladies' aids. What shocked moralists was not the devices themselves, but the idea that women were acknowledging their bodily needs at all. For wealthier women, carriage rides posed another challenge. Some carriages were designed with hidden compartments where a chamber pot could slide in and out. This allowed women to squat while riding, though it often left a stench that lingered long after the trip. Guests would politely ignore the odor, just as they ignored the sweat and grime beneath the endless lace. The strangest part was how silence covered everything. Women were never meant to speak of these needs. A lady could faint, sweat, or even soil herself, but admitting such a thing was more scandalous than the act itself. Medical journals from the time quietly admitted that urinary retention and bladder infections were common among women who held themselves too long. Terrified of breaking social codes, in every way, the Victorian dress was a lie. It promised grace, purity, and control, but it trapped women in a cycle of discomfort and shame. Beneath those gowns, nature was not elegant, and the human body refused to follow society's rules. But here lies the deeper question. If women were so restricted by fashion, who decided they must suffer for beauty? None. Why was control over their most private acts considered a mark of civilization? Victorian society was obsessed with propriety and appearances. Yet behind the polished manners and grand gowns lurked a silent threat: disease. Hygiene was shockingly poor by modern standards. While women struggled with hoops, bustles, and layers of skirts, they were often forced to relieve themselves in conditions that spread germs at an alarming rate. Public restrooms for women were almost non-existent. Like men who had access to urinals and pubs with facilities, women had very few options. This forced them to either hold it painfully long, resort to chamber pots and carriages, or use the infamous urinettes, portable flasks hidden under skirts. But none of these solutions were hygienic. Most chamber pots were rarely cleaned properly, especially when women traveled. Some would simply be emptied out of carriage windows or tossed into the street at night. In tightly packed cities like London, where horse manure, rotting food, and open sewage already filled the streets, this added another layer of filth. Imagine the stench of waste, combined with damp cobblestones and coal smoke. It was a breeding ground for disease. Doctors at the time warned of miasma, or poisonous air, as the cause of sickness. While their theory was wrong, their observations were not. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery were rampant. Women's long skirts, which dragged across dirty streets, often brought contaminated material right back into the home. The very dresses designed to display elegance became carriers of disease. Even in wealthier homes, danger persisted. Many Victorian women used commodes built into furniture, disguised as elegant chairs. But these hidden pots trapped odors and bacteria. Servants tasked with cleaning them risked constant exposure to human waste. For the upper class, illness from their own secret habits was often blamed on weak constitutions, when in truth, it was poor sanitation. The greatest irony was that Queen Victoria herself helped inspire stricter moral codes for women. Yet society made no proper accommodation for their basic needs. While ladies were expected to be pure and modest, they were also forced to navigate disgusting and dangerous ways of relieving themselves. The unspoken reality was clear. Beneath the silks and lace, the fight for dignity came at the cost of health. Every carriage ride, every ballroom, every crowded street carried the invisible shadow of disease, hidden just like the chamber pots beneath their gowns. But the story does not end there. Because as disease spread, reformers began to fight for change. And in the battle over women's most basic bodily function, a new chapter in public health would emerge. As cities like London grew more crowded, the need for public toilets became undeniable. But here lies the shocking truth. While men's public urinals began appearing in the mid-19th century, women were left behind. The idea of a public toilet for women was considered almost obscene. Why? Because Victorian society believed that acknowledging a woman might need to relieve herself was improper. So, women were expected to either hold it, run home, or depend on dangerous alternatives. In the 1850s, a handful of ladies' conveniences were quietly introduced in London and Paris. These toilets were hidden underground, often with guarded entrances so women wouldn't be seen entering. But even these sparked outrage. Critics argued that public toilets would encourage immoral women to wander the streets more freely, or even use them for prostitution. Women simply trying to survive daily life shopping, working, or traveling were caught in a cruel double standard. The lack of access was more than just uncomfortable, it was political. Women's rights activists in the late 19th century pointed out that, without toilets, women couldn't spend long hours outside the home. They couldn't attend rallies, join workplaces, or even travel far. The absence of restrooms was a hidden barrier that kept them confined. Newspapers mocked these complaints, calling them petty concerns, but for women in giant gowns and corsets, it was a daily humiliation. Meanwhile, wealthier women had other strategies. Some carried small urination devices tucked into reticules, while others relied on expensive carriages, which acted as private toilets on wheels. For the working poor, however, there was no such luxury. Many women turned to alleyways, or chamber pots, hidden in baskets, praying they wouldn't be caught. If discovered, they faced public shame, ridicule, or worse. This silent scandal, women, excluded from basic sanitation, remained an open wound through the Victorian age. Behind the glamour of sweeping dresses and gilded halls was a truth society tried to cover up. Women were suffering, and often sick, because of something as simple as being denied a place to go. But this silent struggle was about to push society into change. And it wouldn't come from aristocrats, but from protests and movements that forced the world to confront the absurd injustice. The problem of women relieving themselves in giant Victorian dresses was not just a private struggle, it became a public health issue that few dared to name. Cities like London and Paris were overwhelmed by the smells of overflowing cesspits, horse manure, and factory smoke. To add to this, the lack of toilets for women meant that many simply relieved themselves wherever they could. Parks, alleys, and stairwells became hidden sites of desperation. Servants sometimes carried chamber pots behind their mistresses during long public outings. An unspoken burden never acknowledged in polite society. Doctors and reformers noticed the consequences. Women who avoided drinking water to escape the pain of searching for toilets often fainted, grew ill, or developed bladder infections. Some Victorian physicians quietly wrote about a mysterious female malady, not realizing it was often just dehydration or untreated urinary problems, caused by restrictive fashion and the absence of facilities. Yet, society chose to remain silent. Public conversations about women's bodily needs were seen as vulgar, unfit for drawing rooms or newspapers. The silence carried into legislation. Men received public conveniences in parks and on busy streets, But proposals for female restrooms were rejected as unnecessary or scandalous. If women truly belonged in the home, why would they need toilets in the city? This cruel logic ignored the thousands of working-class women who labored in shops, markets, and factories. They endured constant humiliation, forced to hold it in until their shifts ended, sometimes for more than 12 hours. What made this more chilling was how normalized the suffering became. Diaries from middle-class women mentioned fainting during social events, chalked up to delicate nerves. In reality, it was often the unbearable discomfort of corsets, heavy gowns, and the lack of access to toilets. Society turned this pain into a symbol of femininity. Frailty was seen as elegant, even desirable. The very suffering of women became a fashion statement. Behind the polished surface of Victorian gentility, then, was a quiet epidemic. Illness, fainting, and shame, all rooted in the simple human act of relieving oneself. And still, the world pretended it did not exist. But the cracks in silence were forming. Women began whispering about their struggles. Campaigners were rising, demanding dignity. The question was, would society finally listen? The story of how Victorian women relieved themselves beneath layers of lace and steel is not just a quirky fact of history. It is a window into the absurd contradictions of an age obsessed. With appearance and control, women were trapped in cages of fashion, forced to maintain an illusion of grace, while quietly suffering through humiliating realities that no etiquette manual would dare to print. Yet these hidden details reveal something bigger. The Victorian era was not just about elegance, tea parties, and royal balls. It was also about discomfort, disease, and repression. The same dresses that symbolized wealth and refinement also imprisoned women, limiting their mobility, independence, and even their dignity in the most basic human functions. Today, it is easy to laugh at the thought of someone balancing over a chamber pot while hidden beneath a mountain of fabric. But in truth, it was a daily struggle that reminded women of their lack of freedom in a society designed by men. Fashion dictated their movements. Social rules dictated their silence. In history, for the most part, tried to erase these private realities. By revisiting these hidden corners of the past, we uncover the double standards that shaped women's lives. For every sparkling ballroom, there was a hidden chamber pot. For every portrait of elegance, there was a moment of discomfort no artist would ever paint. These truths remind us that history is not just what is shown in books and portraits, it is also the unspoken, the awkward, and the human. And perhaps that is the most important lesson behind every grand dress. Every royal figure and every perfect performance, there is always a hidden reality. One that tells us far more about the truth of human life than any polished image ever could.